Let's get started. Entering the historic galleries of the Bharhut sculptures of the Indian Museum is as if being transported back in time to the ancient world. The viewer is at once immersed in the early imaginary, surrounded by trees, vines, jewels, and fruits, intertwined with visual stories along the colossal railing that once stood around the Bharhut stupa. Yakshas, yakshis, devatas, nagas, and other figures are carved in full-bodied forms, lining the curvature of the railing and welcoming those who enter the path to the stupa. The stories from the carved railing of the Bharhut stupa, which are cherished by many who have visited here, are playful and imaginative. So we must first consider the landscape in which the original stupa once stood before the railing in Torana arrived in Kolkata, which is where I began my dissertation research. The history of the site's excavator and founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, Alexander Cunningham. Photographs taken by Joseph Fiegler in 1875 reveal sculptures found at the site, some broken and many separated from the structure of what was once a railing around the stupa. From Cunningham's publications, we can see on the left the plan of the site at the time it was excavated, and in addition to the label of the stupa's original location, there are remains of brick monastic buildings, maybe monastic buildings, near to the original mound. On the right, Cunningham has demonstrated the 4 gateways that once stood around the original stupa mound. Here's a photograph of the Bharhut stupa as it stands today on the side of the hill Lal Pahar in Madhya Pradesh. While the entire railing was removed during excavations, the circular shape of the mound is still visible on this side of the hill. One of the great mysteries of the Bharhut stupa is that of its lost pieces, which were carried on the SS Indus. The ship sunk in 1885 while carrying the sculptures from Calcutta to London, passing through Colombo, Sri Lanka. The Bharhut sculptures from this ship were lost and have not been recovered to this day. For this reason, most of the remaining sculptures which are on display at the Indian Museum are a deeply valuable resource for understanding the ancient world. Much of the research that is done today is the practice of reimagining their original historical context. As the viewer begins to walk along what was once the inner railing of the stupa, stories from the ancient imaginary unfold. Here is a photograph showing the inner gateway and railing that is on display in the main Bharhut gallery. Today, I will be speaking interchangeably about stories between texts and images, 2 types of sources that seem to intertwine at the site for the modern researcher, like the twisting nodes of a vine. Shifting away from the paradigm of searching for an original text for the story, which would have existed before Bharhut itself, I am interested in themes evolving between iterations of the story in the ancient world. Although the ideas and social practices were not limited to Buddhist contexts, in many ways they retain primary elements from stories that came before the sculptures we see, and perhaps even the stories of Pali themselves. Though today we will be investigating specifically the monastic site and its viewers. On one pillar of the gateway that survives is an inscription that states, Suganam Raje, meaning in the reign of the Shungas. The gateway was caused to be made, and the stonework was presented by Dhanavati. With its prominent placement on the inner pillar of the Torana entrance, the inscription takes on a staging power with its visual presence. As well-known historian Daud Ali has characterized this type of inscription, of the political sphere with its very first phrase. There are 2 main types of inscriptions, apart from this one, that we find on the Bharhut sculptures. Inscriptions marking stone pillar and railing gifts, and narrative label inscriptions. With deep incision and clarity, the inscriptions were undoubtedly meant to be read. Just as we stand back to look at the railing, and a knowing viewer recalls the titles and the stories, monks and nuns likely acted as narrative reciters or storytellers for different types of viewers. These most likely included visitors from the local surrounding communities, as well as those from nearby ancient cities. For instance, one gift is recorded from Nagasena from Pataliputra, and several are recorded from Vidisa, including the named first pillar, Chapadeva and Uttarakuru, among others. One relic carrier on the back of an elephant is carved on the face at the edge of the railing near the gateway, recalling the history of the division of the relics. At the time of the Buddha's parinirvana, in accordance with the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, the relics were divided into 8 parts. Within the Ajatashatru narrative image at the Indian Museum, the king worships a living Buddha, depicted in absence as a stone seed, with chhatri and malas, and a pair of footprints with Dhamma wheels below. Inscribed on the right of this image is the inscription, Ajatasattu Bhagavato Vamdate, which translates as, Ajatashatru worships the Blessed One. The king Ajatashatru is described in the sutra as having taken a procession with bazaars, established all the way from Kushinara to Rajagriha in Magadha. After the Mallas cremated the remains, the relics were carried in a casket or a domi and worshipped with flower offerings until reaching their destination at the Magadha capital. From a long vine that extends across the railing of the Bharhut stupa, larger-than-life jewels, garlands, and flowers blossom between unfolding sculpted stories. For viewers that once walked around the stupa for circumambulation, contrasting with an everyday existence of the natural forest that once stretched across the hilltop of this monastery, the undulating vine carved on the inner circumambulatory pathway of the stupa bursts forth with vivid stories of the ancient imaginary. Within the vast collection of early Buddhist stories, the merit of actions from the past lives ripens over time, and sweet fragrances and glistening light can act as portents of auspicious karmic events to come. In this same way, I suggest that the floral garlands and colossal jewelry bloom forth as both a direct result and foretelling of the Buddhist stories brought to life in stone sculpture along the top of the railing. The vine, as a budding collection of visual stories, offers a remarkable glimpse at Buddhist teachings in narrative, one in which the very carved scenes imbue meritorious beauty into the surrounding world. As the stories unfold across the railing of the Bharhut stupa, the flowers along the vine grow between them into spectacular garlands and bejeweled necklaces of enormous sizes. While elements of the vine evoke known plants and excavated jewelry as flowers that bloom necklaces, they are unlike anything from this world. The tendency to imagine the Buddhist teachings within a strict morality of a textual corpus written for monks, which Gregory Chopin once argued with Inscriptions, does not always reflect the historical reality of practitioners. Originally in scholarship on Bharhut, the exaggerated size of the budding flowers and jewels was attributed to decorative art, rather than exploring embellished vines in connection with early Buddhist conceptions or of ancient social life. Many Pali words for vines or creepers exist throughout early Buddhist narratives and provide opportunity for interpreting their meanings in the ancient imaginary. Most often, the word for creeper in both Pali and Sanskrit is either lata or vali. The vocabulary for describing parts of a creeper vine is notably expansive in Pali. This is by no means a coincidence. As in many languages, the plethora of words and attention to differentiation speaks to their complexity in usage. As for the parts of the vine itself, the tips of a creeper are koti. Its fruit is the pala. A twig or rod of the creeper is veta. The shoots or spreadings of a creeper are santana. And there are also words for the way a creeper grows, such as a creeper that carries like a garland is haraka, a creeper that binds together with its bands are bandhana, a creeper that hangs down with tendrils is vilambin, which means possessing tendrils. A creeper that wavers or quivers is pandana, and a very long creeper is maluba. While at Bharhut, the lata blooms meritorious beauty into the space surrounding the stupa, not all vines in the Buddhist imaginary had a positive connotation. They are the ripening pala, literally the fruit or result of right actions from the stories themselves, and the very act of retelling them. Much like the fruit is the result of karmic actions, there's also a danger of a creeper gone bad, with spoiled fruit, for instance, in the Dadivahana of Jataka. The speedy growing forward and grasping pieces of the vine branches are also compared in other contexts with the concept of tanha, or craving. As the feeling of greediness grows, just like the vines, it expands and continues to grasp at the world in a way that leads to suffering. Yet the concept of avarice, while significant, is not the meaning found within the visual depictions of Bharhut's vines. Instead, they are likened with meritorious growth and auspicious protection, looming forward with the visual stories of the Dhamma. Amazing attention is paid to the growth of creepers in Buddhist stories within a variety of contexts. The standing figures of yakshas, yakshinis, and others, such as the Chulakoka Devata, greet the viewer at near eye level with astounding beauty and auspicious ornament. She grasps with her right hand the branch of the Ashoka tree, her body curved and her arm as well as her leg on the left side of her body, completely entwined around the tree's trunk. The lata is imagined as the alankara of the natural world in ancient sources, not only Buddhist sources, ornamenting trees and forests with expansive green shoots, with spiraling tendrils and flowering branches that expand in all directions. Much like the exquisite jewelry that ornaments the ideal body, the flowers, fruits, and tendrils of the lata adorn the spaces on which it grows. The vine is also compared with jewelry that ornaments the body. Renowned art historian Vidya Deheja has suggested the centrality of ornament as auspicious, protective, and as completing the idealized female body as ubiquitous in South Asian art. She considers how in Kavya, the natural world is used in simile and metaphor as a way to characterize the flowing beauty, movement, and vibrancy of alankara, adorning the female body that appears in sculpture. Even in the text of the Kasava Jataka, the ivory bangle made by the ivory workers is ubiquitous with the description of the vine growing as ornament. The ivory bracelet rolls onto the wrist, just like the creeper grows in an undulating motion described as valaya, and thus it's called Danta Valaya. That which grows forth from the meritorious vines along the lata of the Vedika is not only larger than life, but it also resembles exquisite jewelry that survives from the ancient world. Take, for instance, a set of gold ear ornaments at the Metropolitan Museum of Art from South Asia dated to the early 1st century BC, luminous in 40 pounds of gold. Crafted with the technique of repoussé, two full-bodied elephants on either side emerge from the curved central spire of the ornaments and are decorated with individually hammered granules, wire, and sheets, as well as palmette shapes on the reverse, here on the bottom. Upon looking more closely at the depicted alankara of carved standing figures around the Bharhut stupa railing, ear ornaments of almost identical shape and design can be found on many of the female figures. Next, we are greeted by Sirima Devata, whose wide lotus-shaped eyes seem to gaze directly at the viewer when walking towards her tall standing frame. Let us consider how an image that indicates the Tavatimsa gardens are an important part of the Bharhut imaginary as connected with divine imagery. One pillar relief depicts Buddha preaching in Tavatimsa while visiting his mother and converting the devas to the Dhamma in the top scene, descending to earth at Samkhisa in the middle scene, and finally preaching to the Samkhisa community on earth in the bottom scene. In the middle, the descent from Tavatimsa down to earth is rendered with a ladder, and Buddha's footprints at both the top and bottom of the central rungs. Buddha is indicated between the tree and stone seat in Tavatimsa heaven at the top of the ladder, then with another tree and stone seat below the ladder at the moment of his arrival on earth. There has been scholarly debate about whether this is representation of a narrative panel with multivalent meaning or a shrine at the historical site of Samkhisa. In ancient India, the physical location and descent itself were one and the same. Since the image does not represent a mimetic picture of that descent in the Buddha's own time, or a particular moment in which the scene was being worshipped at Samkhisa in the recent past, the artist has created a new image that evokes these two visions of the past. The carved sculptures of Bharhut must be analyzed within a genealogy of terms and their precedents. My dissertation reconsiders the meaning and status of carved images at the site of Bharhut for different viewers through a close look at Pali and Sanskrit textual traditions. For instance, it is known that the Bodhi tree serves as one of many emblems that represent the Buddha before the anthropomorphic body arrives historically in carvings to represent the Buddha. However, the sculpture of the tree and its uniqueness at Bharhut have been lost in a fractured system of linguistical differences. The meaning of these sculptures from circa the 2nd century BC has been lost in the art historical discipline that favors the ancient Greek system of mimesis, the Renaissance ideal of beauty as innately humanist, the world in which time is linear, and the art image that represents an object or a person in real time and space. The Buddhists of this time left us with an extraordinary set of visual and textual narratives which tell us about how they thought about the world, extending the Buddha's words, body, and image through replication helped preserve this way of life. These beliefs are now considered beyond the natural laws of this world, and for that reason have been overlooked. One telling feature which makes this clear is the representation of footprints that recall the Buddha's bodily form during the descent. The Blessed One said to the Venerable Ananda, "Ananda, it may be that you will think the teacher's instruction has ceased. We have no teacher. It should not be seen like this, Ananda. That Dhamma and Vinaya, which has been taught by me to you after my passing, Mama Achayena, that will be your teacher." So next, we will consider references to earthly gardens in relevant textual and visual sources. In the Jatakas, kings and wealthy landowners most often have a private garden for leisure and other behaviors cultivated among social elite full of natural marvels. In Jataka stories featuring wealthy householders, their garden on earth as a space of leisure is called Arama Uyana. The word Arama derives from Ramati, meaning to delight in, and comes to describe a place intended for enjoyment, often describing a grove or park filled with beautiful fruits, flowers, and trees, and eventually becoming the word for the natural secluded area around a monastery. The concept of owning and cultivating the natural world as a marker of social status permeates much of the early Buddhist narrative literature. Flower makers and other household servants taking the role of gardener or caretaker for the palace gardens regularly attend to leisure gardens of householders for their enjoyment, such as those who grow and then make flowered garlands. They're called malakara. Likewise, a groundskeeper is called aramapala. Most famous among all the gardens on earth in the Buddha's lifetime was that of Anathapindika, who donated the grove that he bought from Prince Jeta, son of King Pasenadi or Prasenajit, for the first monastery. At Bharhut, in one sculpture, the merchant Anathapindika stands in the center, holding a water vessel to seal his gift to Buddha, and the image is inscribed, Anathapindika gives the Jetavana bought with several kotis. As part of his offering, men on the right cover the ground of the Jeta's grove with 18,000 coins, with which Prince Jeta finally agreed to its purchase. In the text of the Chulavaga, the royal pleasure garden of the prince is referred to as the Uyana Arama. When initially searching for the location of the monastery, the Buddha told Anathapindika to look for somewhere accessible, yet secluded, and it is with this description that he found Prince Jeta's beautiful grove in the forest. The tree shined with a small railing around the base in this image on the screen should be newly interpreted as the Buddha in emblematic form, receiving the gift. For many years of Buddha's lifetime, he lived in the Jeta Grove teaching monks. The artist has also represented and inscribed the Gandhakuti, the perfume chamber where the Buddha always resides, and the Kosavakuti, for the quarrelsome monks of Kosambi that the Buddha welcomes to stay at Jeta's Grove. From the notion of Uyana Arama, evolved the name of an Arama as an open space of seclusion that has been given to the monks in the Sangha. On one image of the Bharhut railing, an elephant bites down on the branches of a lata, beginning our auspicious entry point into the collection of Buddhist stories to come. The Pali word for elephant, hatan, literally meaning having a hand, a hand in this image that mirrors the curves of the creepers. They use their pliable, lengthy trunks to tug at the roots, vines, and branches of all kinds of plants, sometimes playfully pulling at branches or even uprooting trees to fulfill their enormous appetite. In this sculpture and in others at the edge of the Bharhut railing sculptures, the vine continues growing far beyond the elephant's mouth as auspicious. With the understanding that all life is dukkha, which is the first of the Four Noble Truths of Buddha's initial teachings, comes a need to understand the suffering of this world in many, many different forms. Those familiar with the Vinaya, a text which carries the rules for monastic conduct, know too well that every rule has been added after some monk misbehaves or exemplifies an act based on ill intent, oftentimes in a humorous way. Through the process of recitation during the rainy seasons between different monastic communities, the collection of 547 Jataka stories must have initially had different variations before being written down. The sculptures are a completely unique source from the ancient world, in which the exact titles of the Jatakas correspond with the text as recorded in Pali. Yet, although one might expect them to correlate with the order of births in the Pali Jataka texts, they do not follow this order at all. In these stories, the Buddha often tells of a time once long ago with a feeling of nostalgia from a past life of another time. Historical incorporation is a prominent theme of the lessons in the stories from the Buddha's past lives, exemplified here through visual tropes in the narratives. Since the Jatakas were initially shared through an oral monastic recitation practice, I propose that we consider the variation in scenes in the visual stories as an evolving discourse between oral, textual, and visual narratives over time, without prioritizing the texts. While one might expect the Bharhut to bloom forward with stories of complete and utter perfection centered around the Bodhisattva, the Jataka stories in visual and textual form almost always offer a glimpse into another character's suffering, whether the suffering of an animal or a human. In Unfortunate Birth, Reiko Onuma writes that in Buddhist textual stories, animals play a special role. Deer, for instance, as characters present an opportunity to reflect on what it means to be human, exhibiting generosity, compassion, and self-sacrifice, especially as animal saviors. Just as the narrative world of the meritorious Lata reflects and contrasts with the natural landscape surrounding the monastery, in the same way, the animals in the Vedika scenes contrast with animals in the wild. Yet the animals also contrast with the viewer themselves. They ultimately offer the viewer an opportunity on what it means to be human. As I investigate the visual stories across the Bharhut railing and the meritorious blooming forth of the coping vine, I will consider the moral lessons, if there are any, of each story in relation to early Buddhist texts and to the viewer as worshipper. One of such gardens with heavenly beauty on earth can be found in several scenes from the Bharhut railing. On the right of these hanging floral and jeweled garlands, from the mouth of the first elephant, are several scenes from a floating island known as Uttarakuru, where the kaparuka or kalpa tree grows. A woman gently plucks the spouting rice grains that stem from the curve of the lata that frames the image, as if sprouting from the vine itself. Described in the Artanatiya Sutta, the Divyavadana, and the Dhammapada Artakatha, as well as the Mahabharata, it's a lot of text for one image. The unique inhabitants of Uttarakuru to the north of Jambudvipa live in a charmed life. The forest of Uttarakuru bears perpetual fruit that satisfies all of one's desires, in which ornaments and garlands arise, which the artist has actually depicted in these scenes. They cook sweet rice without need for plow or sow, and it replenishes itself while cooking within golden vessels. Children, born in pairs of the opposite sex and raised equally, are fed by their parents from the milk of the trees, which is as sweet as amrita. Strong birds with sharp beaks carry the dead away to mountain caves. The island of Uttarakuru, a place in the sky said to have only been accessible for temporary visits for Buddhas and ascetics with iddhi, or supernatural powers, was very separate from the world we know. The Buddha himself was said to have made trips to Uttarakuru for alms, as the island was never lacking in abundance of delicious food and other delights. The Attanatiya Sutta describes how they live without hunger and without greed, without any need to own property, bound to a certain lifespan, live in elegance, and have 4 qualities that surpass the Tathagata. The intrigue of Uttarakuru lies in the complete ease of its lifestyle, in a world without greed, starvation, and suffering. For a knowledgeable viewer, the island of Uttarakuru represents the portion of living where individuals can realize the teaching in our world full of suffering. For those unfamiliar with the story, the depiction of otherworldly Uttarakuru as an abode of beauty, ease, and abundance, the blooming forth of meritorious beauty on the railing of the stupa, is nonetheless embodied here. At the edge of one Vedika, one of the 2 largest in the gallery, a series of sculpted Jataka scenes that correspond with the Pali Nikayas unfold from a meritorious lata. In the first story, labeled Sujato Gahuto Jataka, an ox is seated where the node of the vine slopes downward into several stems. In this Jataka scene, the artist represents the moment in which Sujata gently bends to feed a dead ox, as there is a futility of his father attending the grandfather after death, which will not bring him back to life. His hooves rest on a very large spiraling tendril below, and there is a man standing beside him extending grass as if to feed him. The inscription identifies this as the Sujata Jataka, number 353, or the story of the Bodhisattva in a past life as Sujata, the landowner that tries to feed a dead ox to help his father when his grandfather dies. After Sujata's grandfather dies, his father erects a stupa for him and offers flowers, becoming so overcome with grief. Thus, the artist represents a scene in which the compassionate Sujata relieves his father's suffering, and his father is relieved in the end. The text of the Jataka begins when the Buddha, while dwelling at the Jetavana, tells the monks of a landowner who did not breathe, beginning with the words, "Why haste to bring?" This is the beginning of a verse in which the Buddha asks, why haste to bring fresh grass to a lifeless ox, as a metaphor for his father's unending lamentations over the death of his grandfather. Upon the father's realization of what his son had done for him, he says in the text, "My dear wise son Sujata, it is known to me that all things that are existent are impermanent, anicca. From now on, I will not grieve." After the Buddha ended the teaching, he tells the monks at Jetavana the landowner had attained the fruition of the first path, and that he himself was a bodhisattva reborn as the wise son Sujata. As the narrative unfolds, the vine continues underneath the hooves of the ox and Sujata, the vine blooming forth with meritorious splendor into tendrils that extend into trumpeted flowers with bejeweled necklaces. The next story begins where the node of the lata curves downwards, revealing a tree on which there is a bird and a cat, standing nearby in a scene labeled Vidala Jataka, or Kukuta Jataka. When the Bodhisattva was reborn as a rooster in the forest with many hundred others in the text of the Kukuta Jataka, which is number 383, a female cat had eaten all the others except the Bodhisattva. In the depicted scene, the female cat appears looking up to the tree at the Bodhisattva rooster, requesting that he come down from the tree to marry her. However, this is a complete deception, as she wants to eat him. Knowing that the female cat ate all the other roosters, he escapes and avoids the sorrow of straying from the monastic path. One of the more playful stories, the deceitful cat and the wise Bodhisattva offer a humorous take on their contrasting characters. Described beauty and offer of marriage from the untrustworthy cat in the story are a visual metaphor of the 8 precepts for monks, one of which is to abstain from sexual behavior after ordination. The artist has depicted the moment from the Jataka in which the cat uses flattering words to deceive the bird, like when a monk longs for sensual pleasures after having taken his vows. The text of the Jataka begins when the Buddha, while dwelling at the Jetavana, tells the monks of this cat that deceived the rooster, coaxing him with praises that the rooster has a crest that droops so gracefully. The Bodhisattva, as the rooster, manages to drive away the cat with perfect wisdom and escapes her clutches, just as a monk may avoid a deceitful woman that may lure him away in longing for the world. After the Buddha ended the teaching, he tells the monks at the Jetavana that the backsliding monk was established in the fruition of the first path, and that the Bodhisattva was the rooster in that very story. Through the power of merit, as the visual story unfolds, small swirling tendrils extend above the cat, and flowers with bell-shaped buds and garlands within the frame of the scene unfold as expounding perfect wisdom in stone. A cluster of 7 fully ripe, plump mangoes dangle down from the lata, and a vine node curves downwards into the main stem, beginning the next scene. And a Jataka in this sculpted medallion, one of my favorites, a monkey king who is really the Buddha in a past life, saves the lives of his fellow monkeys from the king's hunting troops. He stretches his body as a bridge between 2 trees on either side of the river so that the monkeys can cross to safety. Called the Mahakapi Jataka, the image is carved on the railing. The king, amazed at the sacrifice of the monkey king and his bravery, can be found at the bottom of the image. After having brought him down to safety, he receives a teaching from the virtuous monkey king. On the right of the image, the monkeys of all ages and sizes in the tree prepare to cross over the back of the monkey king. In the end, the Buddha as a monkey teaches the Dhamma to the king, and a figure at the bottom, perhaps a donor or a man of the king's retinue, listens with hands over his heart. So now I would like to address some of the main threads of investigation that have developed during my fieldwork in Satna, Madhya Pradesh, as questions I am asking moving forward in my research for my dissertation. The first issue is that of decline of the Buddhist community after the reign of the Shungas. Abhishek Amar, for instance, in his work on 13th century Magadha, has drawn scholarly attention to the problem of uncritical readings of Buddhist and Islamic material and textual records that become consistent in a period of Indian nationalism in the 20th century. Akira Shimada, reading Swansong's 7th century travel documents against the grain, and especially through his study of Shankaran, and Shashi Ahawat, who has studied Sufi shrines against the dramatic reading of conquest in Nalanda, are both scholars working to transform these kinds of problematic readings. During fieldwork, I encountered Buddha anthropomorphic images from the Gupta period, kept at Shiva Temples, preserved now as archaeological sites under the ASI. While we all know the importance of Shiva Temples, many of which were excavated in Madhya Pradesh during the 20th century, they are rarely discussed in historiography on early historic Buddhist stupas. So you can see here the Bhumara temple from the Gupta period and the Ekam from the original sanctum. Here is a view showing the hill of Lal Pahar, which stands directly across from the nearby hill where the temple is placed. After my own study of Shiva sites and ancient Buddhist anthropomorphic images west of early historic stupas and settlements on Lal Pahar, my dissertation reads against the narrative of decline of Buddhist communities at Bharhut. So one of the questions I seek to ask next is what occurs after the Shunga period near modern-day Satna in Madhya Pradesh. Another important paradigm for my research is that of reuse. While Jason Hawkes' archaeological study has edified the site's chronology and remains key in its study of landscape, he has not studied the Gupta period images and the issue of red sandstone from Lal Pahar, which is used even to this day as markers of property in villages surrounding and in this particular nearby medieval fort, in which the stone pillars are used as ceiling beams. One important find is that of a Bharhut pillar that is currently in worship, as at a goddess temple near the archaeological site of the stupa. Blurred lines between what is distinctly Buddhist in a monolithic sense are not always as they have been considered in scholarship. The importance of contemporary worship and treatment of the Buddhist pillar from Bharhut, in addition to the prevalence of ancient Buddhist sculptures and the plethora of Shiva temples, I have reported over 5 lingas in the vicinity, both dating from the Gupta period, have led me to question their significance in the ancient world. For instance, one of my chapters reevaluates the notion of dana, looking to literary sources beyond the Buddhist tradition for a comprehensive understanding of the term, with visual depictions at the forefront of this investigation. See, for instance, the scene from the coping of the Bharhut railing, in which Vesantra seals the gift of the white elephant, as also described in the Vesantra Jataka. As I hope I have shown in my reading of the Jatakas, my work reads the image as a primary source, without prioritizing text as the most important recension of narratives. It is of the utmost importance that as scholars of art history and the material world, that we consider images and texts as evolving discourses, changing throughout history in various iterations and different mediums, and that we take the time to consider the images themselves, as many scholars have done with textual sources over the years. Walking along the circumambulatory pathway of Bharhut, guided by the elephant's gaze toward the thicket of roots, lines, nodes, and stems that bloom forward fruits, jewels, and meritorious stories filled with immense beauty, the worshipper cultivates faith in the presence of the stupa. Whether the ancient viewer did stop to look at each of the stories, in accordance with our modern vision that the monks designated as reciters listed in the Vinaya texts themselves, guided lay visitors, or perhaps that they simply bore witness to the beauty of the vine and its themes as relatable stories of the nostalgic past, one will never know. One verse of the Dhammapada in chapter 19, or chapter 14, entitled The Awakened One, states, "Difficult is the attainment of the human state. Difficult is the life of mortals. Difficult is the hearing of Dhamma. Difficult is the appearance of the awakened one." The verse echoes the first noble truth of the Buddhist teachings, that all life is dukkha, as if sitting in the Jeta grove with the Buddha himself, together the Buddhist stories that have been carved to seem as if blooming forward as the teachings of their very own accord illustrate what it means to be human on the Bharhut Stupa pathway. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that insightful look into the remains of the Buddhist stupas of Bharhut. I think a lot of us have looked at these remains with much and with a lot of questions in our minds. And while we wait for questions to pop into the chat box, I think one of them is already here, but I'd encourage all the participants to please come up with their own questions. I personally was very fascinated with that one particular relief that has now been understood as Kalika Mata by Luke.
Yeah. Yes.
And that just makes me wonder how many of these are actually lost to modern interpretations and how many of them remain undocumented. So were you able to find any more specimens, or were you able to look into any more insights in something similar?
Yeah, that is the big mystery of Bharhut, I think, is where did all of these sculptures go? So in my fieldwork, I basically walked around the vicinity, and there were lots of fragments from lotus medallions. But there was maybe one other pillar, but it was really, really difficult to see because the front had been sealed with a kind of concrete in the shape of Hanuman. And so I think it might be a pillar, but it could also be a stone from Lal Pahar. But apart from that, this is the only pillar that has retained the face of the Bharhut figure. And it's also possible that in the fort that I showed, some of those beams could have been Bharhut pillars, but they're actually completely concealed by the brickwork, so it's impossible to know. So those are some questions that I have too, but for now, that's the only pillar that I've seen that has that kind of transformed identity.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's fascinating to look into how adaptive reuse in this case has actually ruined context for so many of them. So I'm just going to take up one question that's in the chat. This is by Nidhi Patel, who wants to know, can we say that the decorative surfaces observed in the sculptures of Bharhut railings are likely a result of technical compulsion rather than intentional style statement because of the overcrowding of figures, and are deliberately kept shallow by artisans as fear of compromising the railing stability, as some scholars have suggested?
Okay, so the question is about like how technically carvers worked and their ability and the depth of carving. So I personally like to think of the artist as incredibly skilled, not only because they have created monumental railings that are 10 feet tall. I mean, when you go to the museum and you see them, they're much taller than they look in pictures. And also I think the pillar figures, which are very, they're in high relief, gives us some indication that the shallow relief of the coping in other places was very intentional. That being said, it is a lot easier to create a narrative coping that has shallow carving, and I think the density of the figures definitely relates to this idea of abundance and beauty and richness that comes across in the theme of the stories. So I think the complexity, it speaks to their intelligence definitely as craftsmen, and also maybe practical too. It's really difficult to say, but I think especially Bharhut in particular, because of its kind of initially with this debate of the anthropomorphic image between Fouché and also Cunningham, right? This kind of idea of the anthropomorphic image or the body as being a really key development in art historical depiction, right? And this, I talked a little bit about the idea of the Renaissance or of the Greek body. These kinds of ideas in art history have really overshadowed Bharhut as a site and made it seem as if it's kind of simple. So I definitely tend to defend their ability and think about what the skill of emblematic form actually, you know, the complexity of the meanings, because if they wanted to depict a Buddha in anthropomorphic form, you know, I think they would have. So some of these questions are unanswered and some of them we just have to guess, but they're definitely skilled, and maybe it is a practical reason, I'm not sure.
I thank you for that insight nonetheless. The second question we have is by the Tarak Datta from Deccan College. He wants to know what is the significance and possible origin of the lady holding a tree branch that we see at Bharhut in context of the site and its iconographic program.
Yeah, so this idea of the lady holding the tree branch is often called shalabanjika, meaning kind of pulling and breaking the branch as a kind of marker of fertility of a yakshi figure. And I think some scholars have started thinking more about those kinds of representations of female figures with trees beyond just the kind of fertility or auspiciousness. I know Suchandra Ghosh in particular has looked at the kind of leisure or everyday. You know, there are more figures, even on the Torah, and I finally had the opportunity to photograph it. And you can see that some female figures are pulling flowers or fruits from above, and they're not doing the Shalabanjika pose. And also, if you think of the Pompeii Yakshi, there's just variations in this depiction. So I would say in historiography, it's an iconic idea of the Yakshi breaking the branch, and it relates to Maya as the Buddha's mother. When she gives birth to the Buddha, she does the same. But I think there's some really interesting new takes on this kind of representation that may have to do more with gardens and social elite, and just there's some new ideas of how to interpret this from other perspectives that are coming out.
Thank you for that. I think another idea that is often associated with the Shalabhanjika is when you look at the secular sculptures that we've had in the Greco-Roman art, you might find a few prototypes and parallels as well. So the idea that Dr. Osman Boparachi floats around of the motifs that we have in Indian art that were obviously a result of the Greco-Roman interaction at the modern court is something that's worth looking into. So we have another question by Tarak, as he says, in one of the slides, we get to see the depiction of a barrel-shaped roof and a Toran arch. How were these depictions depictions influence religious architecture of the subcontinent in subsequent years?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I've taught in Indian art surveys and have a really fun time teaching. So I don't know if you've ever seen Adam Hardy's book on the temple, but I find his illustrations really helpful, and there's a kind of video that goes along with it and also a dance that he does. But basically he talks about the barreled arches as a kind of a singular barrel structure, right? So it's got a round top and it's made of thatch and wood probably in this time. And you see it as the little faces peer out from the architectural niches across the railing in different scenes, palaces, you know, wherever they are. And then as you go to the Deccan caves, and mainly in the Deccan, you see these kind of barrel arch shapes becoming the facades of caves. And then if you think about Karla, for example, the barrel shapes are replicated and they become these kind of infinite, almost like you're looking in a mirror and it just continues to expand. So it becomes very important for the cave structures, and it also becomes very important for temples. So if you think about the Nagara style temple in which the gavakshas along the Latina, the tower, the shikara, basically they drop and open, kind of like Adam Hardy has suggested, so I also really subscribe to that idea or that theory that the barrel shape becomes a really important marker of religious architecture, and it continues to evolve in different ways beyond those basic types. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Because if you read Stella Kramrisch's take on the Gavaksha, well, the Buddhists actually use it for light entering the vihars, whereas the Hindus generally take this whole metaphoric relationship of the god being the source of the light, which is why the Gavaksha is covered in the middle. So you generally have like a carved relief of the god or the goddess that the temple is dedicated to in Hindu temples. So this whole idea of harnessing sunlight, which for Buddhists really comes from the sun, but for the Hindu comes from their godhead or their main deity, is a very interesting take that Stella Kramrisch has on that. So thank you for bringing that to the fore. We have a lot of questions from people saying, will the recordings be available, or could you share the presentation? So yes, the recording will be available. We'll be making it available on the Speaking Archaeologically YouTube channel. And if you stay in the WhatsApp group, we will be letting you know when the recordings come out. But if you don't stay in the WhatsApp group, we'll still be releasing it on our Instagram, which is where most of you contacted us from. So I'd encourage participants to please type in their questions. So if anybody wants to unmute themselves or ask something, please raise your hand so that we can take your questions. I think while we wait for the questions to pop in, one small question from my end is, how much did the inscriptions help you, if at all, with identification of the jata going on? Because a lot of them just talk about who's donated this particular pillar or who's given the money for carving that particular relief. But is there anything else that the inscriptions really help you with, or are the inscriptions absolutely arbitrary when it comes to the Bharhut stupa?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and different kind of a stupa, although the discovery of Sanati kind of changed that, because when it was first excavated, it was the only stupa in which there were label, quote unquote, label inscriptions. In the sense, the Jataka name is also written above many of the depicted stories. So there are two types of inscriptions. There are narrative titles, which are written in Brahmi in a kind of Prakrit, and also donative inscriptions, which we see also as Chanchi and many other sites. But because the kind of identifications of the Jatakas are so clear and specific, and they've helped us identify the Jatakas or other texts that are depicted, a lot of, we've been able to understand a lot about for example, the emblematic representation. When it says the Blessed One, that's really transformed our understanding of what's being depicted. If you see Bhagavato, then it definitely indicates that the Buddha is there, and it follows the story of the narratives also. So that confirmed that. So I think it's interesting to think about what those labels do, and if they're simply labels. But the two types of inscriptions working at the site, they're both, they have a wealth of information to study further.
Right, thank you. And we finally have a raised hand. So whenever you're ready, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, ma'am. I am from Sri Lanka. My institution is Buddhist and Pali University of Sri Lanka. I like to ask a question regarding the fauna and floral designs. Have you recognized or identify these floral and faunal features?
Yeah, so actually this work was done long before me, especially Cunningham and the people who were interested in the kind of earlier period of scholarship in decorative art spent a lot of time really thinking about what the details could be in real life. So, but some of the examples are like the rose apple. We also have mangoes. There are kinds of trumpeted flowers. which I haven't confidently identified because there's many kinds of trumpeted flowers, but it's worth mentioning that in some of the narratives, for example, that of the Parijataka tree or the Parishataka tree that we find in the Krishna stories also is part of the Buddhist narratives. And so that tree has the one on earth for the asuras has a trumpeted shape, and it tricks the asuras into thinking they're in heaven. So there, you know, I don't know exactly which trumpeted flower that is. I would love it if someone has a theory, but for the most part, the vines themselves are a kind of conglomerate of different kinds of plants. And yeah, the rose apple, mango, and a lot of jewelry as well.
Okay, thanks.
Jewelry itself is very fascinating when it comes to truth, because you can see parallels of some of these ornaments even percolating to the present day tribal people.
Yes.
And lots of these jewelries are still alive in the area in terms of handing down and, you know, what women wear traditionally. So I think it's a very good insight into how Bharhut serves as the central point of reference for all these sources and all these things. So we have another question in the chat box by Sanskriti from MSU Baroda, and she says, how much does the amalgamation of Mahayana and Heenyan show in the structure of the stupa? Because we see the change through the sculptures itself. What kind of contact can be derived from the carvings and sculptures itself?
Yeah, so the kind of stages of Buddhism, I think, are being largely reformulated by textual scholars. But I can tell you at least what I have read about and what I understand the site to be specifically pre-Mahayana. And the Mahayana groups tend to pick up things that are developing in various schools of Buddhism, many of which we don't have textual sources that remain, but we have a list of all the various schools of the Nikaya, you know, the various kinds. So I think most often people refrain from the term Hinaya now and use Nikayas just because it talks about different schools. And so we have 5 Buddhas in a line, and we have no Maitreya, for example. So that is one basic way to say, okay, you know, there's no Maitreya, there's no future Buddha, and the list of the 5 Buddhas occurs in Pali sources. So we have the sense that early Buddhism of this kind before the site is 200 BC, around there. So it's a really early period before even though the Mahayana date keeps being pushed earlier and earlier, maybe for century CE, I think it's too early for Mahayana.
Thank you for that. We have another question by Vanshika from Delhi University. She says, thank you for the lecture, ma'am. The various female figures in stupa that we have recognized now, were they common knowledge in contemporary times or known only by a few?
Which figures? Sorry, I missed that.
The female figures.
Yeah. So I don't know every kind of viewer and what knowledge they had, but I think when it comes to Bharhut, we have to assume some of the viewers were knowledgeable, just because the stories are very specific and complicated, and they sort of unfold in ways where if you didn't know the story, you know, it would be surprising that they have the exact title and the exact important scene. So I support this idea of a knowing viewer to some extent, right? So probably the monks, we have banakas being inscribed as, on the stupa as donors. So for me, the reciters, there are people who are knowledgeable and sort of understand how the representations came about. But I also like to believe that there were just so many different kinds of viewers, and probably, non-monastic individuals came to the stupa and worshipped also, and maybe they didn't know exactly who these female figures were. It's so hard to know. They're definitely more knowledgeable viewers, and some of it is sort of lost to the past. But the idea of these female figures, it continues as a trope throughout ancient literature, and you find it in various plays, Sanskrit dramas, and these kinds of things. Like the way that even the Yakshi figure is sort of likened to Mahamaya gives us some idea of how these tropes change and are retained and thought of as nostalgic ideas. So I think, even if you look at female figures depicted on temples in various positions, these kinds of things continue to be important representations of women.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So are there any more questions? Feel free to raise your hands. Oh, we have another one. So this says, it was a wonderful lecture, ma'am. This is by Divyan Saxena from MSU as well. Can you please tell a little about the conservation of these stupa remains? Are there any remains in the museum which are highly damaged, as almost all the pictures that we see of the stupa are in a good state of conservation?
It's a great question. Actually, this is a very relevant topic right now because the Indian Museum conservator, R.P. Sinha, has actually been studying the stupa itself to think about how we can move forward with preserving these sculptures. One thing I'm not sure that I mentioned in this talk, but basically there's been like a dark color, like a tinting added to the sculptures. And I can just go back to, the Faisantara Jataka, the red sandstone on Lal Pahar. If you climb up the hill, you can see that the sandstone is more of a reddish color. And here it's brown. So actually during the colonial era, many sculptures, not just Bharhut, were covered with this darker kind of singular, I don't know what the material is exactly, but it's not the original color. And some of the inscriptions, like the inscription on the pillar, which has Shunganam Raje, is basically like there's a darker pigment that's been added. So the question of how to move forward with those is, do we remove this darker color is being debated right now. Also, some of the brackets and these figures have been damaged when they were put back together. And there are Koroshti marks that I have not actually seen myself, but I'm hoping to see at some point that have been covered so you can't actually see those inscriptions. So we are fortunate enough that this fragment of the railing remains and that we can actually go and look at it and understand what the stupa was like. There are broken pieces of the coping, which, they haven't been put back together. And there are also fragmentary, just like smaller pieces that don't have any narrative scenes on them that, there's like a local society that has kept some pieces and they're not, like they don't have any narrative indication on them, but you could tell they're from the stupa. And so there's also a Kalachari inscription on the top of the hill that's in pieces. So there's still a lot of things, even though this has been really well preserved and we're fortunate enough to be able to see it as a kind of standing Torna. It's a really hot issue right now, and I look forward to seeing what happens next.
Hi, thank you for that. Thank you for that wonderful question, Divyansh. Next one we have is by Vansh. I think it's more of an observation. So he says, it's no surprise dance and music figured a lot in Buddhist art, ranging from Ajanta to Amravati. Almost all sculptures describe the Jatak stories or life of Buddha. What makes this particular site interesting is that dancers' names are inscribed in some of the sculptures, like in some of the plates of Bharhut sculpture housed at Indian Museum, Kolkata.
Names of the dancers. I think maybe you mean the gods of the different directions in the bottom scene of the dancers. That's probably what you're thinking of.
I think, because I don't know if any names of the dancers being inscribed.
No, that's probably, it indicates like which direction and which kinds of, but there are actually, the archaeology in charge, he's also a performing musician, and we went around together and looked at all the different types of instruments. And so that's really interesting to see too. They have like a 6-stringed kind of, they call it a lyre. I don't actually know. So I haven't worked on this at all, but I know that other people are interested in music and that you can relate this specifically to like contemporary instruments. And I think one of the reasons that I studied this site too is because of the stories. And I find them really incredible and I love to study them.
That's fascinating. And conversely, if you know of any names of the dancers, please bring them to light. And we'll probably try to look into that ourselves as well, because names of people, that'd be a new find altogether. So if there are any more questions, please raise your hands or feel free to chat box. I think the people waiting just for me to say that. So there's a question by Lakshay Verma from the Institute of Anthropology at Punjab University. He wants to know, he was wondering about how much does anthropomorphism in depiction of characters and Jatak tales relate to the social-cultural context of those times?
So anthropomorphism, I don't know if you would want to elaborate on that further, but just, you mean the idea of the body? So one of the, primary issues of Bharhut itself is that Buddha is never depicted. So in fact, there's a kind of absence or, something that is not being present in a bodily form, except for the bodily relics within the stupa. So that's really interesting. And then in terms of emphasis on the body, I would say that the standing figures on pillars are really interesting in that their bodies seem to kind of come forward, and they're so lifelike because they're actually, if you stand next to the pillars, you notice that they're about, at least my height, I'm 5'4", so you almost look them in the eyes. That's really interesting. And I think there is something really significant about what it means to be human, in the sense the stories show us suffering and different stories along the coping and in medallions that are so relatable. You see people doing like plowing or farming or cooking or listening to different reciters, or these kinds of things can be studied and should be studied for socio-cultural contexts. What does it mean to have a kind of arama, and what is your status? The kings are represented, different people are represented in palatial settings, but then you also have people just plowing. So there are different aspects of society that are interesting to study.
Absolutely. We have a raised hand by Sanskriti. So Sanskriti, wherever you're ready.
Hello and good evening. Actually, I had a question about the fact that there are a lot of temples and stupas that have carvings in them, and they show like the cultural contact, as in if there were foreigners who were actually coming into the region and there was trade or such activities happening. Are there such pictures or carvings that actually showed such kind of contacts in the panels that have been retrieved?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is one standing Yavana figure that I haven't shown here, but would be interesting to look at if that's something that you'd like to think about further. There's a Yavana figure, and there are also Kuroshti markers on the Torana. So the Arapachana was a kind of way in the Northwest in ancient Gandhara to mark the order from right to left of sculptures. So we have some idea that at least the craftsmen working on the Torana were writing in Kuroshti, which is interesting. So probably they were from the Northwest. So those are both interesting ways to think about the Indo-Greeks, but there are also evidences around Bharhut from the same kind of time period. Well, if you think about the Ashokan inscription that gives the names of Indo-Greek kings, there's just a lot of work that's been done on the kind of context that relates to Bharhut. And I think certainly it shouldn't be thought of in isolation, that it's Cunningham once thought that Bharhut itself was along a kind of trade route in a forest, somewhere between Vidisha and Pataliputra. So although it's not a kind of major city site like Vidisha, Sanchi, or, it has that kind of potentially aristocratic kind of identity at the same time that it's within a kind of secluded but accessible area, maybe like a kind of caravanserai or something. And if you think of it that way, through that interpretation, definitely there would have been different traders and people who would have been trying to get to different important places in India in the ancient world.
Right, Sanskriti, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, ma'am.
Right, thank you so much. So if there are no more questions, I think I'd like to bring the question and answer session to an end. And thank you once again, Charlotte, for making this such an insightful talk into this, the reliefs and the remains of Bharhut, specifically the ones at Indian Museum, which, like we were talking about at the beginning of the session, are absolutely inaccessible. You can't look at them. And if you can look at them, you can't photograph them. So kudos to you for the wonderful research that you've done. And we wish you all the best for your future and for your results.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was a delight to be here.
It was lovely to have you here. Also, thank you to our wonderfully patient audience.